say that third time's a charm, and with that in mind, welcome to Aeolian Sands episode 3. On this week's show, does the Middle East have a problem with mobile phones? Specifically, do we use them too much? And what do our friends and family think of our constant scrolling? Also, we'll be looking at de-extinction. Real-life Jurassic Park is on its way. And what happens if the rubber never hits the road? Something frightening is afoot that could affect everything from the shoes you wear to the cars you drive. But first, it's time for me to introduce the brains of the programme. Mir, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Strong, yeah. Looking forward to today's programmes. Lots to get through. So without further ado, we looked at mobile phone use as our big, bold question for this week's programme. And we specifically worked out what family and friends think of us spending time on our phones. So this week's big, bold question. When I'm with friends and family, I wish they would spend less time on their phone. And we got people to strongly disagree, to strongly agree, and see what they thought. And here's the big reveal. Nearly 8 out of 10 people, 79% to be exact, wish that their family and friends would spend less time on their phone when they're with them. It's quite a scary statistic, that.
Yeah, but not surprising.
No, not at all. I mean, we all sit there in different situations, whether we're in a restaurant, and all you have to do is look around and you see everybody just sitting on their phones, and it's quite disturbing. And then you maybe you go to to watch the football. And instead of interacting with the person next to you, you're there tweeting away on your phone instead of interacting with the people that you're with. Why do you think it's a problem, though? Do you think it's a problem? Is it just the natural evolution of how we interact with each other is now on the phone rather than face to face?
Yeah, I think with the smartphone, it's always on you, and one could argue that it's an extension of our bodies. So essentially, we're cyborgs. That's my opinion. I think also what's interesting is it's not only the smartphone and the technology, but also the rise of social media. I think that creates and has a lot of negative and positive effects. Negative being it has an addictive trait to it. And I think there are different elements of, increased anxiety, FOMO, fear of missing out. And that kind of causes people to continuously look at their phone, pick it up, even when perhaps there is no notification or there's no reason to do so.
Yeah, I mean, these mobile phones, they're interfering with human relationships. They were designed to provide stronger connections. And now it appears that they're affecting the very relationships that they were designed to strengthen. We might want our friends to stop being on their phones so much, but sometimes we're not so good at it ourselves. When we look at the older the age demographic, apparently the stronger the feeling that mobile phones interfere with face-to-face relationships. This was one of the things that came out of our big, bold question this week. The older you are, so older generations, they think that mobile phones are interfering with those interactions more than the younger generations. And parents are more likely than singles or married couples without children to desire less phone time when meeting with friends and family. So what you're finding is perhaps the family dynamic, where you've got parents and children, they're seeing their children being on their phones. The parents themselves, perhaps they're responding to work issues, or they're messaging their friends as well. So parents, children, they're not perhaps connecting as well as they should be.
Yeah, I've wanted to look at some global data to see actually how many times a day do you pick up your phone. So what do you think? Individuals check their phones an average of how many times a day?
50?
Very close. 58 times each day. And do you think it's more prevalent on the weekdays or weekends?
Weekdays, I would say. I'd say I'd put my phone down at weekends more.
Yeah, 52% of phone checks occur during working hours and on weekdays. But I think what's interesting is that the scarier kind of stat around the fact that we're picking up our phone 58 times a day is that picking up the phone can become a habit. So half of all screen time sessions begin within 3 minutes of the last time you picked up your phone. So it's the fact that it's not only that you're picking up your phone 58 times a day on average, but it's also that it's reinforcing that habit of continuously having to look at your phone.
And perhaps that's why people are saying, well, metaverse isn't going to be that far away from what we're already doing, because we're already constantly looking at our phones. The other aspect of this is looking at how long you're spending on your phone. Are you spending lots and lots of time total-wise? So I had a look at my screen time last week, and it scared the living daylights out of me that I spend 5 hours and 46 minutes per day on average on my phone. And that just seems like an incredible amount of time that I'm spending on there. But then it kind of makes sense because I'm WhatsApping clients. I might be spending time on calls, checking my emails whilst on the go. So it kind of makes sense that I'm spending a lot of time, but 5 hours, 46 minutes, it seems a ridiculous amount of time. So I dug a little bit deeper into it. What am I doing on there? A lot of WhatsApp is on there, emails, social like Instagram, looking at Reddit threads, maybe 3 a.m, diving deep into it, sort of in the middle of the night, not being able to sleep, maybe looking at what's happening on Reddit on some weird and wonderful thread, and NFL Game Pass, which I follow a lot of American football, so naturally that was going to be probably up there in my top 5. It's just a lot of time to be spending on there, and I'm sure if I were to take that nearly 6 hours of time and turn it into something else, I wonder what I could do with that.
Yeah, it's amazing. So 5 hours 46. The global average for time spent on phones by people is 3 hours 15 minutes.
Wow. So I'm doing much more.
Yeah, 5 hours. The globally, Filipinos spend the highest amount of average time on their phones, which is around the 5 hours 20-minute mark. And the UAE average...
I haven't checked my heritage, but I don't think I've got any Filipino heritage.
And UAE is somewhere around, the average is 4 hours 35 minutes. So you're still above the UAE and Saudi Arabia average.
Right.
So you're closer to the Philippines.
So I need to cut
people
down.
In the Philippines. Absolutely. And I think also when I checked mine was super high as well. I think it was around 6 hours something. The kind of biggest usage was Gmail and WhatsApp was the highest, and then Gmail, and then third YouTube. But that's probably because I'm just leaving it on and falling asleep, which is also another really bad habit of, that's one of the ways they say you should cut down on your phone time is, don't take the phone with you to the bedroom or when you're going to, or trying to fall asleep. But yeah, that kind of white noise of some weird YouTube video playing in the background helps me fall asleep. So
now we also looked at whether we think our own behavior on phones is a problem. So this is a dual part big question this week. And specifically, we asked people to select which of the following statements apply to them. I spend too much time on my phone, but that's okay. I spend too much time on my phone and I'd like to cut back. I spend just the right amount of time on my phone, or I don't get enough time to spend on my phone. And overwhelmingly, 63%, so around 2/3 of people think that they spend too long on their phones. Around about 33%, so a third, think that they spend exactly the right amount of time on their phone, and just 4% think they don't get enough time to spend on their phones. But perhaps scarily, 40% of people think they have a problem. So they would like to spend less time on their phone. They want to find ways to cut back, which potentially is a huge opportunity for businesses, for organizations, which can help people reduce the amount of time they're spending on their phone.
Yeah. But again, like, what is the right amount? I don't know if there's enough behavioral science data or research that has suggested what's the kind of sweet spot for the amount of time that you should be spending on the phone. Obviously they're both psychological, mental, but also physical effects of screen time in general. I remember going back to before phones, when we'd be playing video games or watching TV, parents would always say, like, don't sit so close to the TV, you're going to ruin your eyesight. hence the glasses. But
well, just to say, I was also in there. I've got 20/20 vision, and
so,
I don't think there's necessarily
I think
any
that's
comparison.
just something parents told us to scare us. But again, I don't know what is the right time and
But I think
right amount of time, and also are people. It's clearly people are responding in this way because they feel some sense of detachment when they're on their phone, right? Both the data points that we polled suggest that. What exactly are the negative effects they're seeing would be quite interesting to examine.
Yeah, and when we look at it, actually nearly half of 18 to 24-year-olds want to cut back on how often they use their phone. So 46%, which is quite high. Actually, the older the age groups, according to a study by Nisreen Amin and Robert Willis, which is about age and smartphone adoption and use in the United Arab Emirates, older age groups are more likely to develop habits. So what we're finding is that younger people are more readily able to identify that they perhaps have an issue. So kind of converse to traditional thinking that young people want to spend more time on the phone and they think that they should be on their phone more. It's actually the opposite that's true. It kind of goes against a lot of the information that's kind of been in the market that young people just want to spend every waking moment on their phones. Actually, quite a lot of them know that they need to spend less time. I saw something the other day which was someone had posted a video of their grandfather playing Candy Crush. And apparently this, according to the video, this guy's in the top 10 Candy Crush players in the whole wide world or something, and he's in his 80s. Now I've done absolutely no journalistic references there. I haven't researched it, but it kind of makes sense that older generations, perhaps they've got a bit more time on their hands, they would be spending time on games which they might play. And maybe that's a trend that we're going to see more in the future, is older generations being gamers, older generations having habits which they just focus in on one thing that they do consistently on phones. Emiratis and Arab expats were far more likely to express a desire to cut back on their phone usage at 48%, compared to Westerners at 38% and Asian expats at 36%. So Emiratis, Arab expats want to turn off their phone more, which is quite an interesting finding for this region anyway.
Yeah, I think that going back to the Gen Z finding, so it was 46%?
Okay, so 46% of 18 to 24-year-olds want to cut back on how often they use their phone.
Yeah, and that kind of is almost in par with global data. 41% of Gen Z claim to be actively taking steps to reducing their screen time. A recent report that came out and findings published by Priory Wellbeing Center in Dubai, they said anxiety was the largest single driver behind 10 to 19-year-olds seeking treatment. So they've seen an exponential rise in terms of the amount of children aged under 10. Almost a quarter of them are receiving treatment for emotional or behavioral problems caused by attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And kind of what's interesting is that they've seen this rise over the past 2 years. This could be what they assume one of the contributing factors could be with the onset of the pandemic, being indoors, increased screen time, a shift to online learning methods. And these are all kind of concerns that they have and that they're seeing within this younger age group. So, the generation following Gen Z. And also the rise of social media and the type of content that they're subscribing to, such as, TikTok, Reels, YouTube Shorts, everything's within that format of 10 to 20 seconds, 30 seconds. These are all habits that are being ingrained, and clearly they're seeing the adverse mental effects of this.
Yeah, and focus is definitely something which is across all age groups. If you're spending too long on your phone, apparently focus is really affected by that. So what can be done? I had a look at ways in which we can, if you want to turn down the amount of time that you're spending on your phone. What are the reduction methods? Well, firstly is actually being aware of how long you're spending on there. So monitoring your behavior, turning off notifications. We constantly get bombarded with pop-ups on our phone that make us interact more with that technology. By actually turning off notifications, you can heavily reduce the amount of time you're spending on your phone. Setting time limits, so you can either do that, manually just by monitoring it yourself, or far more effectively, you can actually set limits on the technology itself. So, for example, Instagram, if you're spending too long on there, you can set a limit on the app itself to reduce how long you're spending on there. And it can give you a warning that says, hey, look, you've spent half an hour on it today. Do you want to continue using it? Now, it doesn't automatically turn it off. Yeah. So you have to be disciplined enough to follow your own instruction. And turning the phone to grayscale. I started messing around with this earlier. Wow, doesn't your phone look so much less interesting if you're using it on grayscale? Because apps are designed to be colorful. They're designed to be more engaging visually.
Yeah, to hold your attention.
And when it's actually black and white and it's grayscale, it just isn't as interesting, and you don't actually want to interact with it as much. So maybe that's the top tip. Going on there, if you're an iPhone user like I am, it's under settings, accessibility. It's under there, and you can choose it by the color filter, and you can switch it to grayscale. And I'd be interested to know whether that actually affects people's behavior. I'm going to give it a go, and I'll see how much time I can reduce it over the next week or two.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. We're going to be, I think I read there are going to be 7.6 billion mobile subscriptions by 2027. A lot of the developing world, or the global south, pretty much the smartphone is their access to staying connected with family, being able to conduct their day-to-day life. And I think the more we're going to see mobile phones being a part of our day-to-day life, I fear that a lot of people will not be able to set those boundaries. And like you said, number one, won't even be aware of the effects that it has on their mental health or their physical interactions, social interactions. So is there, beyond the personal user, is there any other way that we could potentially limit smartphone usage?
Well, if it's an addiction, which perhaps for some people it is an addiction, if you've recognized that it's a problem and I'm struggling to cut back, that's almost the definition of an addiction. So are there organizations where you can detox? Of course there are. There are retreats which are mobile phone free. Maybe that's one step forward. Maybe it's actually setting a whole day aside where you don't interact with technology to break the cycle. There's different things that you can do to try and help you to break your regular constant usage of mobile technology. But I think just in the inevitability of the fact that our personal lives and our professional lives are interwoven with mobile phones, there's very few people, I think, that could do without a mobile phone, given the world that we live in at the moment, unless you want to totally break away from society and go and live like a hermit in a log cabin in a wood somewhere, which doesn't sound that bad, actually.
Yeah.
If you went and did that, yeah, okay, great, you can return to the wilderness if you like. But I don't think that many people can do that. If you've got a mobile phone problem, hit us up on social media, on TikTok at Aeolian Sands, on Instagram at duke_mir, and on LinkedIn, you can just search for duke+mir. Okay, part 2 of the show is in the news. And this is where we're looking at things that are lighting up our phones with notifications and on our social accounts, what's been really popular over the past couple of weeks. And we found this incredible news that's coming out of Colossal Biosciences. They've raised $150 million to de-extinct a bunch of animals, everything from the dodo to the woolly mammoth. People are actually investing money. This is venture capitalists putting money into Colossal Biosciences because they want to bring back animals that died out hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. Mir, what on earth is this story about?
For me, it's really science fiction. Again, I don't know what the real world implications of this are going to be. So since they launched in 2021, September, they've raised a total of $225 million in funding. and they expect this latest infusion to advance their genetic engineering and specifically to bring back the woolly mammoth. And this is all in a bid to offset carbon within the Siberian tundra, and it's mind-boggling for me.
Yeah, so obviously woolly mammoths, they died out around 10,000 or so years ago. The last ice age, the Pleistocene epoch, finished, and the woolly mammoths died out. Climate evolved around them, and it was too warm. Perhaps humans came in, hunted them down as well. And according to Colossal Biosciences website, our teams have collected viable DNA samples. It's all very Jurassic Park there, isn't it? You imagine the amber with the mosquito in it. They're apparently editing the genes that will allow, and I'm quoting here, this wonderful megafauna to once again thunder through the Arctic. Look, firstly, fantastic. I can automatically picture myself there in the Arctic watching the woolly mammoth. So kudos to whoever the comms team are at Colossal Biosciences. They've done a tremendous job of wording some of these things to really attract those investors in. But we've got a bundle of issues with trying to save the animals that already exist in the Arctic, let alone bringing more in, like woolly mammoths, which died out a long, long time ago.
100%. And I think, like you just pointed out, how much of this is hype to inject funding into programs such as de-extinction, versus actually funding the preservation and conservation of species that are at risk. And I believe that kind of funding would be spending the same amount of money on traditional conservation efforts could save a lot more of the species than de-extinction.
So the other one that they're trying to bring back at Colossal Biosciences is the dodo. This is a bird which we all know of, which died out around 1600 in Mauritius. It was a combination of destruction of habitat and humans hunting them. So what they're going to do is they're going to take DNA from the dodo's closest living relative, which is apparently the Nicobar pigeon, and edit the DNA within it to resemble dodo cells. And one of the people behind this, a molecular biologist called Beth Shapiro, apparently has been studying the dodo for 2 decades. Now, forgive me looking at this and thinking, why would you want to study something which died out in 1600 for 2 decades? You want to spend 20 years of your life looking at the dodo in order to bring it back? I mean, why? This bird wasn't that cool back in the day when you were, strolling through Mauritius back in 1600. Yeah. Nobody was going, "Oh, look, it's a dodo. Oh, it's amazing." This was basically just a glorified pigeon. Why are we bothering to bring back the dodo when we've got so many other animals on this planet? Now, the question is, what would you do instead? If you've got $150 million, instead of de-extinction, maybe we redivert that to saving current species, what would you do?
Well, I mean, it would go back to these conservation initiatives across the world. And again, the idea of cloning animals is not new. If you remember Dolly the sheep back in the mid-90s, right? That was the first time that an animal or a mammal was successfully cloned. But since then, in 2003, there was the cloning of an endangered animal, which was a special species of cattle found in Southeast Asia, again, to boost those populations, to protect them from the risk of extinction. Same with the giant panda, they're trying to do that, the white rhino. So there are species that currently do exist that are of this time. I think that's what's really kind of the key thing with this de-extinction aim and purpose that they have, is that will the woolly mammoth or the dodo or a saber-toothed tiger, will they still be able to survive or successfully contribute to within the ecosystem, given how the world is at the moment, from climate to geography, topography, etc. And that's to be seen. This woolly mammoth they're going to use an Indian elephant, if I'm not mistaken, as the host, and then release it within this environment where it hasn't lived for over 10,000 years? I don't know.
It's a strange one, but there are some lessons that we can learn. So let's imagine that they get to a point where they can bring back a woolly mammoth or a dodo. Firstly, the point of this is that they think it's rebalancing natural ecosystems. And this idea, again, isn't new. So they've been doing things like rewilding for quite a long time. And there have been good examples of that as to where ecosystems have managed to balance out. For example, one of the most commonly cited was the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone. They brought back wolves, which naturally balanced out some of the wolves' prey, basically, which were overpopulating, which kind of made sense. And they started off with, I think, 14 wolves, and which has grown now to nearly 100. But basically, these packs keep a lot of the roaming wildlife in check. So there are good examples, but there's also huge failed projects. In the Netherlands, now forgive me, I'm going to absolutely ruin this name, the Oostvaardersplassen is a man-made area. It was underwater. The Dutch created all sorts of canals and dikes, and they recovered the land. And what happened was it was a wetland, and a lot of birds came in from which hadn't been seen there for an awfully long time. They wanted to protect this area, and they found that actually, if they didn't have anything to stop the growth of plants, it would very soon become woodland. So what they did was they brought in cattle, horses, deer, to try and keep the grazing of the land, so that it would mean that the rest of the wildlife would thrive. Now, it all kind of made sense for quite a number of years, but then the cattle and the deer and the horses, they started to overpopulate, as is always the case, and they started to eat all of the vegetation, and the populations of these creatures exploded. And in the end, such large populations couldn't be sustained. And there was a year, just a few years ago, where a huge number of these animals, thousands, starved to death during the winter. They just didn't have enough nutrition. They'd overgrazed the land, and there was nothing left for them. And you wandered through this huge, wonderful wildlife reserve, and there were a load of dead animals. And what they found was that humans had to actually step in, that nature itself couldn't balance itself because it was not a natural area. They therefore had to rebalance it, and they had to cull a huge number of animals to bring it back into some semblance of order. And I think the lesson from this is it's hugely difficult to manage. Then there's also the science fiction. We've all seen Jurassic Park. It is naturally what you think of when you think of de-extinction. It's what we've all grown up to think of when it comes to this. And the lessons from that is, whilst we might not be introducing a T-Rex, woolly mammoths are pretty big. I wouldn't want to be messing with one of those. What if they start to overpopulate and start entering, tundrous regions in Russia or Canada, and start to interact with communities? There's all sorts of negatives that are potentially in place if not managed. And that's the big question, is how does Colossal Biosciences manage it, both from an ethical standpoint and also for the human element and interaction with human populations? How are they going to manage the animals to make sure that they can't? But I think it's quite a few years away before we're going to be seeing a woolly mammoth strolling down the streets.
Yeah, and I think as this technology progresses, or we'll be watching how Colossal progresses with their initiatives, as with climate change, as with over the past 2 decades with the ethical concerns around cloning. I think we're going to see increased debate, whether right or wrong, right? Nature versus nurture, trying to regenerate these ecosystems by forcing new species, flora, fauna within that ecosystem. Is that going to work? And more importantly, can capital and VC funding be deployed in other areas which have a proven track record to be able to help the environment or different species to not get extinct, rather than bringing things that are already extinct back?
I think from my perspective, if I had $150 million and I was going to do one thing to try and to sort of balance out ecosystems, I'd probably look at the oceans, and I'd try and find intelligent ways to reduce the loss of the plastics in the oceans. I read something the other day whereby they were finding microplastics in people's blood, which is an incredibly scary thought. And we don't know the implications right now as to how that's going to affect people. But what they have done is they found how it affects cells in smaller animals. Some science tests have been done on that, and they found that it can cause all sorts of stresses in human responses, inflammation, whatever it is. So there's some real dangers there if we are consuming a lot of microplastics, and I think that would be the first thing that I would try and address if I had $150 million. And if anyone wants to give me $150 million to try and answer that question, I'm more than happy to accept it and have a go. Now, the final part of this week's show is Under the Radar. This is where we look at things that may have scuttled past your media feeds or struggled to land in your cerebrum. Mir, tell us about this week's topic.
Yeah, so this is a topic that came to my attention a few days ago, and I kind of started researching a bit more. It's something that's not really talked about that much. We often hear about global threats to the economy, to supply chain, oil, climate change, disruption in different industries. But one that kind of is under the radar, which I thought was quite interesting that we could talk about, is the rubber industry.
So we're talking rubber as in shoes, as in tires, all that kind of stuff. So quite an important material.
Yeah, so the production of natural rubber. So these are produced by rubber tree plants, most commonly within tropical areas, so Southeast Asia, and around 60% of natural rubber production goes towards the manufacturing of tires. So tires on airplanes, tires on your trucks that transport goods all across the world, and automobiles.
And of course, I know that rubber actually is from South America originally. And what happened was that the rubber blight came along. Now, perhaps the most famous blight would be the potato blight. It caused the Irish potato famine and mass migration of lots of people from Ireland to the rest of the world, especially to the US. Rubber blight, same kind of thing, but in rubber plants.
Yeah, and this is kind of a historical lesson that the global economy learned back in the 1930s. 90% of rubber production was in Latin America, mainly Brazil. And this blight, which is a disease, a very fast-spreading disease that affects the rubber tree plants, essentially decimated the entire forest.
Yeah, I was having a look at this in a little bit more detail because I wasn't quite sure how it passed from tree to tree, but it's incredibly invasive. It comes from a fungus, and it produces spores, and it just blows on the wind across the whole forest and just decimates it. And that particular spore, the fungus, is found in South America, which is why you just don't find rubber production in South America anymore.
Yeah,
and they moved it all to Southeast Asia. And they are doing all sorts of things to try and stop that from ever affecting it. But according to kind of the predictive models, it's almost inevitable at some point that it will strike Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and we're back at that point. 90% of the natural rubber supply is from Asia now. So the effect of this disease, if it reaches the different plantations within Asia, could potentially bring global trade, transport, mobility to a halt.
Which is a very scary thought. And the other thing was, I was reading something from one of the plant pathologists, a lady called Karen Garrett of the University of Florida, Gainesville, who was saying that unpredictable and erratic weather patterns brought about by climate change could make things more difficult, more likely to cause an issue. But it's also saying that AI might be the best answer to preventing these kind of blights. So everything from crop surveillance, remote sensing, the predictive models. So where is it going to spread to? As well as breeding more resilient plants that might be able to kind of not be so affected by these kind of blights. There's different things that they can use, which is technology-wise, to try and address these issues before they become a widespread problem. So perhaps we're better prepared now than we were back 100 years ago or so when this was affecting South America.
Yeah, and I think that's the threat of the disease decimating these plantations. But another aspect is also the industry needs to progress and become more sustainable. So while I was researching, 85% of the rubber comes from the unorganized sector. So these are small farmers that have plantations. It's very labor intensive. And they essentially tap these plants for the latex and then sell it within the market. And rubber is traded similar to like a futures commodity, right? So due to the pandemic over the past 2 years, prices have dropped. Countries are stockpiling their levels of natural rubber for production. So these small farmers are essentially looking for alternative plants and they're giving up the rubber plant trade. So that's also another kind of risk towards this industry and the global output of rubber that the world needs.
Now, obviously, rubber plantations, I sort of think of them as one of the contributors towards deforestation of big swathes of natural land. But obviously, rubber is incredibly important for a whole host of different reasons. But how would you actually, for example, create tires for cars if you didn't have rubber?
There are different types of so there's natural rubber and synthetic rubber. So there is a lot of progress that's been made in the production of synthetic rubber, but synthetic rubber does not have the same qualities that natural rubber has. So for the larger, for example, it would not be able to withstand the amount of G's and pressures that a A380, for example, requires when landing, right? Similar with on the road trucks, large vehicles. So, kind of supply chain is one of the key things. There are a number of so synthetic rubber is typically used in everything else that has rubber components. So everything from the soles of your shoes to different latex products, protective equipment, etc.
That's one way of talking about different uses of latex as protective equipment.
Yeah, protective equipment, personal protective equipment. But I think there are a number of different people are testing ways to produce synthetic rubber at scale. And I think over the past couple of years, Continental Tires have been looking at using dandelions as the raw material to produce synthetic rubber for tires. Still a long way to go. From what I understand, you would require insane amounts of hectares of arable land to be able to grow these dandelions, process it to produce the same amount of tires that a rubber tree would produce.
Yeah, apparently is it the Kazakh dandelion?
Yeah.
It would need 10 times the amount of land as rubber plantations. So obviously that's a huge amount in land which we just don't have. I'm pretty interested in this because yesterday I had to change the tires on my car. I was coming back from Abu Dhabi. And valet pulls up with the car, and what's that in the tire? It's a nail in the tire, and I had to go and change it. And it was like, just had a nice relaxing time of things, over a few days in Abu Dhabi, and had to go and change my tire. And there I am sitting, changing the tires at 6 o'clock in the evening, trying to get things sorted. And I just wonder if in a few years' time we're going to end up in a situation where it'll be a choice of, hey, do you want rubber tires or do you want dandelion tires?
Yeah, but again, just the demand and the increasing demand of natural rubber, and the fear of deforestation, climate, and specifically this disease. You wouldn't be able to fulfill the demand of natural rubber within the industries that require rubber to be able to produce those tires. You can't just replace 40 million tons. And that's the scary part of it.
So the key thing here is, can rubber be produced anywhere else in the world? So that, maybe there's different places which, if it gets affected in Southeast Asia, perhaps they can return it back to South America where it originally came from. Maybe a bit of rewilding of plants back there. Are there other options, as you say, synthetic-wise, artificial production to address it? Or are we going to end up in a situation where all those cars that are on the roads, they haven't got any tyres to put on them, and we're in a situation where we see the cost of tyres 10xing, 50xing? Maybe that's an investment opportunity.
Could be, or flying cars. I think we need to start thinking about not driving our cars but flying them.
That's a whole new topic.
Remove the need of tires altogether.
So from Jurassic Park to rewilding and replanting of entire plantations, that's been Aeolian Sands. This is a duke+mir production. If you're not following us, what are you waiting for? You can follow us at duke_mir. That's on Instagram, or you can follow us on TikTok at Aeolian Sands. Namaste.